The sound of the door locking at the end of the day was more than just an ordinary noise. It was the signal that fear had returned to claim its place in my life. For most children, the closing of a door means safety, privacy, or the comfort of knowing their family is nearby. For me, it meant something very different. It was the moment my chest tightened, my pulse raced, and my mind began to search desperately for an escape that never existed. I would sit in silence, listening as the house grew darker, every creak of the floor and every breath around me becoming part of a nightmare I could not avoid. I remember how the air seemed heavier in those hours, as if the walls themselves were aware of what was happening and chose to remain still and silent. My small hands trembled, gripping a blanket that offered no real protection, only the illusion that if I held on tightly enough, I could disappear. The clock on the wall was merciless. The ticking was slow, each second dragging out as if time itself had conspired to prolong the suffering. Fear does not arrive all at once. It seeps in little by little, teaching you to anticipate pain before it even comes. The sound of footsteps in the hallway was enough to freeze my body in place. My breathing became shallow, my ears straining to measure how close the danger was. There is a kind of terror that does not need words or actions, only the certainty that something will happen, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. That was my reality, repeated night after night, until I began to wonder if this was simply the way life was meant to be. Children are supposed to cry for their parents when they are scared, but I had already learned that my cries would not bring comfort, only coldness. I had screamed once early on when the fear first took hold of me. The sound had filled the room, desperate and raw, but instead of arms pulling me close or whispers telling me everything would be all right, there was only indifference. That was the moment when I understood that my voice did not matter. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream I could produce. I tried to find hiding places, small corners in the house where I thought maybe I would be safe for a while. Behind the couch, under the bed, inside the narrow closet where I could curl into myself and hope not to be found. But safety was an illusion. He always knew, as if my fear itself betrayed me, guiding him directly to where I was. And each time I was discovered, the walls of my world closed in tighter, convincing me that escape was impossible. There is something profoundly cruel about growing up with the certainty that the people who should protect you either do not care or choose not to see. The loneliness was unbearable. Even surrounded by others, I felt like a shadow, unseen and unheard. My heart longed for a single gesture of kindness, a word of reassurance, something to remind me that I mattered. Instead, I was met with silence, a silence so sharp it pierced deeper than any scream ever could. The nights were not only about fear of what he might do, but about the betrayal of what she did not do. I would listen for footsteps that never came, for a door that never opened, for a mother who never appeared to say that she believed me, that she would stop him, that I was not alone. Her absence was not just physical, it was a decision to pretend she did not hear, to turn her face away, to convince herself that what was happening was somehow acceptable. That indifference carved a wound in me that words will never fully describe. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into years, I began to carry the silence inside me like an unwanted companion. It shaped the way I moved, the way I spoke, the way I interacted with the world. I smiled less, I spoke less, I trusted less. People around me saw only a quiet child, perhaps shy, perhaps withdrawn. No one ever looked closely enough to see that behind the silence, there was a storm raging, a storm too violent for someone so young to endure. It is strange to think about how quickly a child learns to live two lives. On the outside, I tried to appear normal. I went to school, I sat in classrooms, I even laughed occasionally when I managed to forget for a moment. But inside, I was always bracing myself for the sound of the door, the signal that the nightmare was about to begin again. Even when surrounded by other children, I felt a distance that could never be crossed. They lived in a world of innocence. I lived in a world where innocence was a memory I had already lost. Fear changes the way you experience time. The hours of the day seemed to pass quickly, as if racing towards the inevitable evening. And when night fell, time slowed cruelly, stretching every minute into eternity. I prayed for morning, but even the rising sun felt hollow, because I knew that night would come again and the cycle would repeat. Sleep was not a refuge. Sleep was broken, restless, interrupted by sudden jolts awake, my body trembling from dreams that were not dreams at all, but memories replaying themselves in the dark. Every sense became heightened, tuned to the smallest details of survival. I could hear the faintest shift of weight on the floorboards, the softest change in breathing. I could feel danger in the air before it even entered the room. My body lived in constant readiness, every muscle tense, waiting for impact. This kind of vigilance consumes you, eating away at your ability to rest, to hope, to believe that life can be anything else. Looking back, I realized that what hurt most was not just the fear of him, but the silence of her. To cry out and not be heard, to beg and be dismissed, to hope and be denied. That is a wound that continues to bleed long after the danger has passed. The door closing was not just the sound of a man entering a room. It was the sound of a mother choosing to look away. That sound became the soundtrack of my childhood, echoing louder in my memory than any words ever spoken. And yet, even in the darkest nights, there was a small part of me that clung to the belief that someone, someday, would listen. That somewhere beyond those walls, beyond that silence, there existed a world where children were protected and believed. That fragile hope was all I had to hold on to. It was thin, it was fragile, but it was enough to keep me breathing, enough to keep me waiting for the day when the silence would finally be broken. Before the shadows entered my life, I was simply a child with the kind of dreams that bloom naturally in young hearts. I remember the warmth of the sun on my skin as I played outside, barefoot on the rough ground, my laughter mixing with the sounds of the wind and the birds. I loved the smell of wet earth after a summer rain, how the puddles shimmered like little mirrors reflecting the sky, and how I could imagine entire worlds within them. In those moments, I believed the world was safe. I believed home was a place where nothing bad could ever reach me. That version of me, the one who looked at life with wonder, seems almost like a stranger now. I recall the excitement of simple things, things that most people would overlook. The joy of opening a school book and feeling the crisp pages as if they were filled with secret treasures waiting to be discovered. The thrill of watching a butterfly land near me, its fragile wings carrying a kind of magic that I thought would last forever. My dreams were not grand. They were not about riches or fame. They were about growing up to be loved, to feel safe, to keep laughing the way I did in those fleeting moments of innocence. Children have a natural trust in the world, a sense that the adults around them will keep them from harm. I once had that trust. I once believed in bedtime stories and in the gentle embrace of those who were supposed to protect me. I thought monsters only lived under the bed, shadows that could be chased away with a nightlight or a whispered prayer. But monsters can live inside houses. They can walk in daylight, smile at neighbors, and be respected by everyone outside while destroying everything within. That discovery shattered something in me that never fully healed. The contrast between who I was and who I became is the most painful part of my memories. Before fear took root, I was curious, eager to explore the world. I loved asking questions, the kind that only children think to ask. Why does the moon follow us when we drive at night? Why do the stars seem to twinkle? Why does bread rise when it is baked? Each answer I received fed my imagination, made me believe that life was about discovery and growth. But slowly, my questions stopped. My laughter became rare. The spark that once defined me dimmed until I no longer recognized myself in the mirror. There is a unique kind of grief that comes from losing a childhood you never truly had the chance to live. People think grief only belongs to death. but it also belongs to stolen moments, to broken trust, to the loss of innocence before its time. I grieve for the child who believed she could run into her mother's arms and be protected. I grieve for the girl who thought the world was filled with endless possibility. That grief has no grave to visit, no funeral to mark its passage. It is a wound that lingers quietly, carried alone, hidden behind forced smiles and practiced silence. Even now, I can remember the small rituals that once made me feel safe. The way I would hug my pillow tightly, pretending it was a friend who could comfort me. The way I arranged my toys carefully around me, as if they could form a protective barrier against the darkness that crept into my nights. To an outsider, these details might seem insignificant, but to a child, they were survival. They were the desperate inventions of a mind trying to cling to some sense of safety when the people who should have provided it refused to do so. Every child carries a light within them, a flame made of joy, curiosity, and trust. Mine was bright once, shining even in the smallest of things. But flames can be smothered. Each cruel word, each act of violence, each moment of betrayal dimmed that light until all that remained was a faint glow, hidden deep inside me. And yet, even in the darkest times, a part of me fought to keep that ember alive. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps it was hope, the stubborn belief that life could still hold more than fear. The innocence I once had is gone, but the memory of it remains sharp, like a photograph I cannot put away. I remember the feeling of running with abandon through the fields, my hair tangled by the wind, my heart pounding with joy rather than terror. I remember the sound of laughter bubbling up without effort, laughter that was pure, not forced, not a mask to hide the pain. These memories are fragments of a self I once was, fragments I still carry, even though they now serve as painful reminders of what was stolen. It is important to understand that childhood is not only about play and discovery. It is the foundation of how we learn to see ourselves and the world. When that foundation is cracked, everything built upon it trembles. The child I was wanted to grow into someone strong, someone full of life. Instead, I was taught too early that safety is an illusion, that trust is dangerous, and that silence is the only way to survive. That is not a lesson any child should ever learn, yet it became my reality. Even with everything that happened, I sometimes wonder if that version of me, the one who lived before the fear, still exists somewhere deep inside. Buried under the weight of silence and pain, there is still a whisper of the girl who believed in magic, who saw beauty in raindrops, who laughed at the simplest things. That whisper reminds me that although innocence can be stolen, the memory of it never fully disappears. It lingers, fragile but present, a reminder of who I was before the shadows took over. And in remembering that child, I also remember the sharpness of the contrast. The greater the light once was, the darker the shadows felt when they came. The innocence that once defined me became the measure of the horror that followed. It is why those memories, both sweet and devastating, remain carved into me. They remind me not only of what I lost, but of how deeply that loss shaped everything that came after. He was a man admired by many. To the neighbors, he was respectable, a figure who carried himself with authority and dignity. People greeted him warmly on the street, trusting him without question. In the community, he was seen as someone reliable, someone whose opinion mattered, someone who was above suspicion. But inside the walls of our house, he was nothing like the image he presented to the world. Behind closed doors, his face transformed. His smile turned into a mask that concealed the monster living underneath. It was a duality so sharp that as a child, I could not understand how the same man could be praised by strangers, yet terrify me to the core. The house that should have been a refuge became his kingdom. Every corner carried his presence. Every room was marked by his control. Even in his absence, I could feel the weight of his shadow pressing against me, as if the air itself was poisoned by his authority. I walked carefully, my steps calculated because any noise could trigger his rage. I spoke little because words could be twisted into excuses for punishment. Living in that house meant living in constant anticipation of the storm that never failed to arrive. But what made the storm unbearable was not only his violence, it was the silence of the one person who should have protected me. My mother's eyes told stories she refused to voice. She saw more than she ever admitted. Her silence was not ignorance. It was a decision, one that cut deeper than anything he did to me. She knew, yet chose to look away. She heard, yet pretended not to. She existed beside me, yet left me entirely alone. That betrayal built a wound inside me that has never closed. There is a cruel truth about children in abusive homes. They cling to even the smallest gestures, the tiniest hints that someone might care. I remember watching her hands as she folded laundry, hoping she would reach out and touch my shoulder in comfort. I remember watching her face at dinner, praying she would finally speak the words I needed to hear. But the moments never came. Instead, she carried on as if nothing was happening, as if my suffering was invisible. The denial was more suffocating than the violence itself, because it told me that my pain had no meaning. The contradiction between the man the world adored and the man I knew was like living in two separate realities. Outside, he could stand in front of others, laughing, confident, admired. Inside, he stripped me of everything I was, leaving behind a silence that felt endless. People often say that children lie, that children exaggerate, but I was forced into a silence so heavy that even if I had spoken, who would have believed me? How could I have explained to others that the man they respected was destroying me piece by piece? That contradiction alone was enough to keep me locked in fear. The weight of appearances kept everything in place. Reputation mattered more than truth. Image mattered more than safety. He knew it, and he used it like a weapon. He made sure that his face outside was spotless, because the cleaner the image, the less anyone would question what happened behind the walls of our home. And my mother followed that same path. She smiled to others, spoke kindly, and maintained the illusion of a normal family. Together they built a cage around me, one made of silence and appearances, so polished on the outside that no one ever thought to look inside. I became skilled at hiding, not only my body, but also my emotions. I learned how to keep my face still, how to keep my eyes from showing too much. I learned how to control my voice so that fear would not slip out in front of others. It was survival disguised as obedience. But deep inside, I felt myself vanishing piece by piece, as if every day stripped away a little more of who I was. When a child has to live this way, the house no longer feels like a home. It becomes a prison, and the people inside it are both guards and captors. There were nights when I stared at the ceiling, trying to imagine a different version of life, one where my mother would finally turn towards me instead of away. In those imagined worlds, she would take my hand, pull me close, and whisper that she believed me, that she would never let him hurt me again. I held on to those daydreams desperately because they were the only place where safety existed. But the mornings always came with the same reality: her silence, his presence, and my growing sense of being invisible. The betrayal of a parent is not something a child easily survives. It reshapes everything, twisting the meaning of love, altering the way trust is understood. When the person who is supposed to protect you becomes the person who abandons you, the damage is irreversible. I began to associate love with pain, silence with safety, and betrayal with normalcy. These distorted lessons became the foundation of my understanding of the world, and they followed me long after the days in that house ended. To outsiders, our family looked ordinary, even admirable. We smiled in photographs, we went to gatherings, we presented ourselves exactly as others expected. But photographs can lie, smiles can be masks, appearances can cover wounds so deep they cannot be seen with the naked eye. I lived inside that contradiction, knowing the truth, yet forced to play along with the lie. And with every passing day, the distance between who I truly was and who I had to pretend to be grew wider, until the girl I once knew disappeared almost completely. And still, through it all, a part of me longed for her to change. I longed for her to see me, to break her silence, to defy him, even once. That longing kept me tied to her, even as her betrayal carved wounds into me. Because for a child, hope dies slowly. No matter how deep the pain, no matter how long the silence, there is always a tiny part that waits for the day when everything will be different. That tiny part of me refused to let go, even when everything else told me that nothing would ever change. The nights stretched endlessly, each one unfolding like a cruel ritual I could never escape. As soon as the light of day disappeared and the house fell into silence, my body would begin to tremble with a fear I could not control. I would lie in bed with the blanket pulled tightly under my chin, hoping that if I stayed still enough, if I breathed quietly enough, I could somehow disappear. But fear has a way of amplifying every sound, every movement, every shift of air. The creak of a floorboard or the closing of a door felt like thunder in my chest, announcing what I already knew was coming. I cried into my pillow many nights, trying to muffle the sound of my sobs so no one would hear. It was not that I feared being discovered by strangers. It was the crushing certainty that even if my cries reached the ears of the one person who should have defended me, she would not come. I tested it once. I let my sobs grow louder, calling for her in desperation. She entered the room, looked at me, and with a voice as cold as stone told me to stop crying, to get used to it, because this was only the beginning. Those words shattered something inside me, something that would never heal the same way again. They told me I was alone, that my pain was mine to bear, and that the silence of others would always weigh heavier than my own screams. Every night became a battlefield between my desperate wish to remain invisible and his determination to remind me that I could not hide. I tried curling myself into the smallest version of me, tucking my knees under my chest, pretending that maybe if I became invisible enough, he would lose interest. But he always found me. The anticipation was almost worse than the moments themselves. It was like drowning slowly, knowing the water was filling your lungs but being unable to fight it. I learned to hold my breath, to clench my teeth so no sounds of resistance would escape, because resistance only made it worse. The house itself seemed to join in the cruelty. The walls that should have protected me became the silent witnesses of my suffering. The bed that should have been a place of rest became a prison I was tied to. The air carried the smell of fear, metallic and sharp, mixed with the scent of his presence that I could never wash away. Even the darkness became my enemy, because in that darkness I had no sense of where he was until he was already too close. My eyes would strain in the shadows, but there was no comfort, no safety, only the terror of not knowing the exact second it would begin again. I remember how the nights seemed to last forever. Time lost its meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, and hours stretched into something unmeasurable. I would stare at the cracks in the ceiling, following them like roads, imagining that if I traced them far enough, they would lead me out of that house, out of that life. But imagination only carried me so far. Reality always pulled me back, heavy and merciless. And when the morning finally came, it did not feel like salvation. It felt like a brief pause before everything repeated again. What broke me more deeply than anything was her voice, her choice to side with silence. She was there. She knew. She could have stood between me and the monster, but she never did. Instead, she repeated that same phrase again and again, that I had to get used to it, that this was just the way things were. A mother's words are supposed to comfort, to heal, to reassure. Hers cut through me like knives, sharper than the fear itself. To be dismissed so casually in the moments when I needed her most left scars far beyond what anyone could see. I often wondered if she believed what she was saying, or if those words were her own form of survival. But even as a child, I knew the truth. She chose to protect herself, not me. She chose to shield her own world of appearances rather than defend her daughter. That realization weighed on me more heavily than any act of cruelty he inflicted, because it meant I was not only fighting against him, I was abandoned by her. The betrayal of silence became the cruelest companion of all. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Even when I tried to force myself into numbness, My body reacted. My hands shook uncontrollably, my stomach churned, and my heart pounded so loudly I thought it would burst. Fear became a permanent state of existence. It was written into my skin, etched into the way I carried myself, shaping me into someone who no longer belonged to herself. Nights were supposed to bring rest, but for me they only brought exhaustion layered on exhaustion, until I was living in a body that never knew what peace felt like. There were times when I thought I had reached the limits of what a child could endure, and yet the nights proved me wrong. Every new act of cruelty showed me that suffering could stretch further, deeper, and longer than I had imagined. My tears became rivers that left no trace, because they were never acknowledged. My voice was silenced before it even formed words. And with each night, I slipped further away from the child I had once been, becoming instead a shadow, a hollow version of myself shaped entirely by fear. The silence of the house did not end with the dawn. Even during the day, the weight of the nights followed me. I carried it in my steps, in my lowered eyes, in the way my body tensed at every sudden movement. I learned to live in fragments, splitting myself into the child who tried to function in the daylight and the one who suffered in the dark. This fragmentation became my survival, but it also stole my sense of wholeness, leaving me feeling like I was never truly alive, only existing in the pauses between pain. And through it all, I begged silently for someone to see me, to hear me, to believe me. I wanted someone to notice the way my smile never reached my eyes, to question the way my body flinched at the slightest touch. I wanted someone to ask the right question, to open the right door, to break through the silence that had been forced upon me. That hope was the thin thread that kept me holding on, even when everything else inside me had already begun to unravel. For a long time I believed that no one would ever notice. I thought my silence was invisible, that my body could be broken and my spirit could be crushed without the world ever stopping to ask why. I had become so used to being unheard inside my own home that I assumed it was impossible for anyone outside of it to see me clearly. But one day something shifted. It happened in the smallest of ways, almost too subtle for me to notice, but it was the first time the wall of silence began to crack. It was a teacher who looked at me differently. I do not know if it was the way I avoided eye contact or the way I flinched when someone touched my shoulder. Maybe it was the bruises I tried to hide beneath my clothes, or the constant fatigue that weighed me down, making me older than my years. Children are usually transparent, their emotions written all over their faces, but I had learned to bury mine. Even so, something slipped through, some fracture in the mask I had worked so hard to build, and she saw it. She did not look at me like I was a problem or a burden. She looked at me as if she wanted to understand. That look alone terrified me. I had been conditioned to believe that speaking out was dangerous, that drawing attention would only make things worse. My mind echoed with the warning that I had to endure in silence. But when she asked if I was all right, her voice was soft and patient, not demanding, not intrusive. It lingered in my head long after the words faded. I wanted to answer, but the fear inside me was louder. It wrapped around my throat like a chain, holding the truth hostage before it could escape. At school, I began to notice small acts of kindness from her. She would stop by my desk a little longer than necessary, ask questions that went beyond my grades, and sometimes place a gentle hand on my shoulder, as if to remind me I was not invisible. These gestures, so ordinary to most, felt extraordinary to me. They made me wonder what it would be like to finally be believed. Yet even as hope tried to grow, it was quickly smothered by guilt and shame. Children in my situation often feel that the abuse is somehow their fault, that speaking about it will bring punishment not only to themselves but to everyone around them. I carried that same burden, convinced that breaking the silence would destroy what little stability I had left. The conflict inside me was unbearable. I wanted to be saved, but I was terrified of what salvation might cost. What if no one believed me? What if my words were dismissed the way my cries at night had always been? What if speaking out only unleashed more violence? I weighed these questions every day, torn between the need to escape and the fear of making things worse. My silence became both a shield and a prison. It kept me safe in the moment, but it also kept me trapped in the very nightmare I longed to escape. There were times when the signs on my body became impossible to ignore. A bruise too dark to be explained away, a limp I could not quite hide. When asked about them, I invented stories quickly. I fell while playing, I tripped on the stairs, I was clumsy. The lies rolled off my tongue with practiced ease, each one a desperate attempt to maintain control over a situation I had no control over at all. And yet, I could see in her eyes that she did not believe me. She nodded politely, but the doubt lingered. That doubt terrified me, but it also planted something inside me that I had not felt in years. It planted the possibility of hope. It is strange how hope can feel heavier than despair. Despair is familiar. It numbs you. It teaches you not to expect anything better. Hope, on the other hand, stirs something alive inside you, something fragile and dangerous. I was not ready for it, but it would not leave. I began to imagine what it might be like to finally say the words out loud, to watch someone truly listen, to be pulled out of the darkness I had been trapped in for so long. That imagination became my secret companion, a dream I was too afraid to believe in fully, but too desperate to let go of. Children often wait for a signal, a moment that feels safe enough to let the truth slip out. For me, it was not a single dramatic event, but a gradual unraveling. Each question from her, each time she did not accept my lies without hesitation, each gentle moment of care made the silence inside me harder to bear. It was as though the truth itself was pressing against me, demanding to be spoken, even as fear tried to hold it back. The world around me began to feel different. I started noticing other adults too, wondering if they could see what I was hiding, if they were choosing to ignore it, just like she did at home. I studied their faces, searching for even the slightest sign of recognition. Some looked past me entirely, lost in their own lives, but others lingered, their eyes softening in ways that told me they sensed something was wrong, even if they could not name it. Those glances gave me strength, reminding me that maybe, just maybe, the silence could not last forever. There is a fragile moment when a child first realizes that survival does not have to mean silence. That moment came to me slowly, like a sunrise breaking through a long night. I was still terrified, still convinced that speaking out could destroy me, but I could no longer deny the flicker of light pushing through the cracks of my carefully built wall. That flicker grew stronger each time someone saw me, each time someone refused to believe the lies I told to protect myself. It was not freedom yet, but it was the beginning of something I had never allowed myself to hope for. The possibility of being heard carried with it a strange kind of agony. It made the nights feel longer because now I knew there might be a way out. It made the mornings harder because I struggled to face the people who might notice the truth. Hope did not erase the fear, it magnified it, because for the first time I understood that change was possible, and if change was possible, then silence was no longer enough to survive. It was a heavy realization, one that made me tremble as much as the footsteps in the hallway ever had. And so I lived caught between two worlds, the one where silence kept me safe, and the one where speaking could set me free. The weight of that choice was unbearable for someone so young. Yet beneath it all, something inside me had shifted. I was no longer only waiting for the night to end. I was waiting for the moment when my voice would finally break through the silence that had defined my life for so long. Freedom did not arrive like a sudden storm that sweeps everything away. It came slowly, hesitantly, in fragments that were almost too fragile to trust. At first it was only the whisper of possibility, the quiet recognition that silence did not have to be forever. And then, like cracks spreading through thick glass, the truth began to push its way outward. My voice, which had been buried for so many years, started to tremble into existence. It was not loud at first. It was shaky, broken, uncertain, but it was mine, and for the first time, someone listened. The road to liberation was long and uneven. Speaking out didn't instantly erase the fear. It did not erase the nights I had spent crying into my pillow, or the betrayal that had carved itself into my heart. It did not erase the countless moments when I begged silently for someone to protect me. But it was the beginning of a different story, one where I was no longer invisible. Being believed was like breathing clean air after years of suffocation. It did not heal me overnight, but it gave me permission to exist outside of the silence that had defined my childhood. The process of leaving that house was tangled with confusion, guilt, and shame. Children are not supposed to carry such heavy burdens, yet I carried them everywhere. Even after I was safe, I felt the weight of those nights pressing on me. I wondered if I had done something wrong by finally breaking the silence. I wondered if I was truly worthy of protection, or if the world would turn its back on me once again. Healing is not linear, it comes in waves. Some days I felt strong, as if nothing could touch me anymore. Other days I felt small again, curled into myself, trapped by memories that refused to fade. What I came to understand is that scars do not disappear, and maybe they are not meant to. They remain as reminders of survival, proof that even in the darkest of places, a person can endure. My scars are not signs of weakness, but of resilience. They speak for the child who was silenced, the child who had no choice, the child who was abandoned by those who should have protected her. And by telling this story, I give a voice back, piece by piece. There are people who say that time heals all wounds, but time alone is not enough. What heals is the courage to face the truth, to acknowledge the pain, to speak it aloud even when your voice shakes. What heals is knowing that your suffering has meaning because it can touch others. It can remind them that they are not alone. Every time I share my story, I feel the weight lighten a little, not because the past has changed, but because the silence no longer holds power over me. The betrayal of a mother's silence is something I still carry, but I have learned that her choices are not mine. Her refusal to protect me does not define my worth. Her silence does not erase my existence. For years I believed I was invisible, but I know now that I am not. I am here, I am alive. And even though I carry the scars of my past, I also carry the strength of survival. That strength is what allows me to stand in front of you now and say these words. If you are listening to this, I want you to know that your pain matters. Your voice matters. Even if it has been silenced, even if no one believed you, even if you feel invisible, you are not invisible. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be heard. And you deserve to be free. I survived because somewhere deep inside, I refused to let the darkness define me, and you can survive too. I do not tell my story for pity. I tell it because silence feeds the monsters, and speaking out starves them. I tell it because I know there are others living in the same kind of shadows I once did, waiting for someone to show them that it is possible to step into the light. And if my words can be that light for even one person, then every scar has meaning. To those who stood by me when I finally spoke, to those who chose to believe instead of turning away, I carry endless gratitude. To those who listen now, who open their hearts to stories like mine, you are part of the healing, not only for me, but for countless others. Because every time a story is heard, the silence loses a little more of its power. Thank you for allowing me to share this part of my life. Thank you for giving space to a voice that was once stolen. And thank you for carrying these words with you, because they are not only mine, they belong to every child who ever cried for help and was met with silence. If my story touched you, do not let it end here. Share it, reflect on it, and carry it forward. And if you are ready to continue walking with me through stories that reveal not only the pain, but the strengths of survival, the next video is on your screen right now. I invite you to watch it, because every step we take together is another step toward breaking the silence.